See, well, the Masoretic text was written, the last one we have is right around 975 AD, so that was a little before King James. John, as soon as we're on, I can begin and you can finish, I guess.
Yeah.
Or do we get everything all at once and nothing in between?
I can't believe it's been 7 weeks since we started this, man. Time has flown.
I can believe that, by the way. Oh,
You've been busy working on them guitars for half that time, weren't you? You still doing the guitars?
we packed them all up. Kevy had to go back. So we have all the parts. We have the neck, we have the bodies, we have the I'm live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our 7th presentation of how to study the Bible. This evening we're going to address Revelation. That's singular, not plural. Most people talk about Revelations as if it's a plural designated. It is not, and it was never meant to be, but somehow we started doing that. There are a number of issues of which I'm going to barely touch on. Revelation is something that we tend to avoid, and yet if I was, in fact I make this comment at some point, if I was to ask anyone where in the Bible, and it doesn't matter whether they're a Christian or otherwise, where in the Bible does it tell us about the end of times? Everyone seems to know it, not least of which because of all the movies that's gone on about it and some of the projections. So Revelation is a text that we tend to avoid because for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. But I would admonish everyone that's listening to this or in the audience here that Revelation can be understood, perhaps not all the details, but they're not necessary in order to get a message out of Revelation. But you should end up doing the same kinds of things we've been talking about in terms of the text, the rest of the text, whether it's Psalms or the prophets or the letters or the Gospels. Read the material, and the way to handle Revelation is the same way. Read it all the way through. Feel comfortable with it. Don't stop to try to analyze everything. Read it through. You would do this with every text. Read it through carefully in the sense that you're absorbing some of the verbiage. I wouldn't even stop to write down a lot of things. Most texts I would tell you to do that. Revelation, you could be doing that every 2 minutes. And so you lose the flavor of it. But you want to read it all the way through and then come back and start writing down some of the things you thought and some of the things you felt like and some of the questions you have. Even if they're innumerable, you still have them written down, and you can go back through it and work your way through it. Again, multiple different translations is of real value. A King James kind of version, New American Standard, for example, or the ESV, and then somewhere a different kind of less formal presentation on the translation. NIV comes to my mind, but there are a number of others. Read both of them and get a feel for it. Use the Bible dictionary, and then only go to a commentary. There's nothing wrong with commentaries. The only point I have to make is read it first. Get a feel for it yourself rather than being directed to how to think. Now, a commentary on Revelation is probably essential. I haven't said that as much about the other text because there's a great deal of things in this that both historical as well as the type of verbiage that it has. It is apocalyptic. That is, it has visions. It's the Star Wars of the first century, if you will. Only they didn't have movie theaters and TVs, so they had to use graphic pictures and verbiage, and that's what this is all about. So you want to walk yourself through that, and I'll say some other things as we get into it. What does the Bible address at the end of the world? I've already mentioned that. But as interested as everyone seems to be about what's going to happen, because they feel like that's going to be applicable to themselves, very few really read it. Which is sort of amazing to me in some ways, that if you're that interested, why not read it? Well, they don't. There's 3 different genres in this. What do I mean by that? There is letters, there is prophecy, and there's an apocalyptic kind of style of writing. Each one of those are a little bit different. This text has all 3. Now, we have a few texts that has parts of them in them. Daniel comes to mind. He's got some apocalyptic visions. Ezekiel comes to my mind. I've told you before, Ezekiel is a very unique prophet, but you'll find most of his, well, I shouldn't say most of his imagery, because he has all kinds of things throughout the text, but most of the kind of apocalyptic things we're talking about is in the 37th through the 39th chapter of Ezekiel. Daniel is all the way through. Really, if you read 7th through the 9th chapter, you get the majority of what Daniel is saying in terms of apocalyptic presentation. But the 10th chapter has some in it. The 2nd chapter has some in it. So Daniel is used a great deal in John's Revelation apocalyptic. And of course, there's multiple schools of thought. And I'm going to try to touch on those this evening, as well as the Old Testament. And there's some major quotes from that. Now, apocalyptic literature was something that was very current in the first century. It went from about 200 BC through at least the first century, and probably you could put 200 to 200 on there for a nice round number to remember. It went out of fashion somewhere around 140, 150 AD, but still, so 200 BC to 200 AD is a nice round number that apocalyptic literature in vogue, if you will. Now, again, the genres, it is a letter. We have the 7 letters of the church, 7 churches. I mean, the letters to the 7 churches. And ironically enough, well, it's not really ironic, but if you look at a map and you consider the island of Patmos, where John was located, we know that because of Revelation, you'll find that the way he addressed the letters are in a round circle as a mailman would be delivering these letters. And they go all the way around and etc. So if you look at a map, you'll find that these letters fall in that kind of category as somebody taking it around. Whether, as I've said before, they really didn't have mail people to deliver things, but somebody, a messenger, would have been doing it. And he would have taken that route around, circling it. And all the churches, for all intents and purposes, are in Turkey. If you look at Turkey, that's where the 7 churches are. And Patmos is just outside of it, on an island, isolated there. In terms of the Old Testament, let's see if I don't have that yet. Well, let me throw something at you, and I want you to think about this a minute. If I was to give you in the United States now, if I was to give you a picture of a donkey, you would immediately think of a political party. You really would. And in particular, if I put an elephant alongside it, now we're thinking about both the political parties. If I were to put a money wagon between them with them pulling, you'd pick up the image. Are there donkeys and elephants in the United States that are pulling money carts? I sincerely doubt that. But you know right away what I would mean with that kind of an image. That is, a donkey on one side and an elephant on the other side, says the political parties are trying to pull the U.S. economy back and forth. I won't go into any more detail. That image would tell you what you would need to know. I wouldn't have to really explain that to anyone. In the 21st century or the 20th century, and particularly the United States. Now, if you go to some other country, and you go to another time period, you wouldn't understand that. Is it relevant? Absolutely. But you wouldn't understand it without somebody looking at it and say, well, during their history, they had 2 primary political parties, and they argued over how they should spend the money, and that's what they did. Now, what application does that have to us? Well, it means that in whatever governmental system we now live, if you will, or you might live at, it could have to do with pulling the economics, etc. That is how you're supposed to take the images of Revelation. They understood they understood these images. John had a very specific purpose for it, and what we need to do is to get into the elephant and donkey syndrome and think about what these images were, what did they use them for, how did they use them, what did John want them to think about when he was throwing them all out, and only at that point do we go to pull them out. For example, the 19th chapter of Revelation talks about the bride and etc. and wearing bridal clothes. Most of the males in this audience and online has never worn a dress or a bridal clothes or any of the other kinds of things. I assume Shirley has, but I mean, okay, she's the exception to this. Does that have an application to me? Absolutely. We are the bride of Christ. And that image is supposed to be being portrayed to us in such a way that we can understand that and think in terms that we are part of that. Again, the images and pictures that John is trying to graphically write here in Revelation is to get your minds on the thoughts. And that's what he was really after. And the difficulty is that the 7 churches, and I'll probably talk about this sometime, so I'll just start right now. The 7 churches in Turkey, more than perhaps any other parts of the Roman Empire, was worshiping the emperor. That was a predominant thing to be doing in the seven church area, is emperor worship. And as it became much more a part of their everyday lives, their work guilds and etc., sort of like our unions in the 60s, 1960s. If you didn't belong to one of those guilds, if you didn't follow one of those, you didn't work. You didn't have a job. You were systematically pushed out. Now, there wasn't an enormous amount of persecution at this point in time. And my feeling very quickly, and I'll tell you up front, that my personal feeling is that Revelation was written about AD 95, 96, something along those lines. Now, there is a group of scholars that look at it, although not very well adhered to today, that everything happened before AD 70. They picked that because the 11th chapter talks about the temple, and the temple in 95 was already destroyed. There's a lot of reason for it. I'm not going to go into that. But in AD 95, we don't have a great deal of the persecution that took place in the latter part of the 60s. Nero, for example. Paul was executed during roughly AD 68. Peter was executed probably AD 67, 68, something like that, both of them in Rome. And so there was a great deal of persecution with Nero, and we'll get to how he affects this a little bit. But there was a great deal of pressure to the churches in AD 90s, and it was going to become more so. And John perceived that, realized that, and was trying to get the churches to say, you know, you need to be adhering to Jesus. You need to be adhering to the text. You need to be adhering to what God wants you to do. You don't succumb to these issues. And if you read the seven churches, only one of them, well, two maybe, was looked upon as having done what they were supposed to do. And you get Laodicea, was a real mess economically, that just felt like, well, if I go to church, that's fine. So John is seeing the possibility that the church is going to encounter an enormous amount of persecution, and it's going to accelerate. He was absolutely right. As we break into the 2nd century, it started in a big way, and he was doing everything he could to get the churches to realize that, and he's using graphic images to give the picture. He's also, and you'll hear me say this multiple times with the book of Revelation, trying to tell the churches, God is going to win. God is in charge. Despite all the problems that you're going to face, difficulties that you're running into, God is going to win. In fact, we have a term, it's a seminary kind of term, it's called realized eschatology. What does that mean? Sounds nice terms, sort of like what Dr. Richard uses when he's talking about the medical problems that people have. Something that you may not grasp by that. Realized eschatology is that which is going to happen, and it's guaranteed to happen. Eschatology is what's going to happen in the future. What realized is you can accept the fact that has happened even though it hasn't come to a conclusion. There is a great deal of realized eschatology in Revelation. That is, these things have occurred when they hadn't occurred yet. You see them projected. John's talking about them as if they had occurred, because as far as he was concerned, God's in charge. They have occurred. There's no question that it's going to happen. So when you're reading Revelation, there is a great deal of realized eschatology. There is not a chronological order to it. Well, that's the best I could do for your dragon that you'll find in the 12th chapter. He doesn't have multiple heads and he's not red, but that was all I could come up with in my feeble way of trying to start this out. The 12th and 13th chapter of Revelation is the central part of the book. If you get beyond the 7 letters and saying you ought to be doing X, Y, Z, and you need to get your act back together, and then you're going into that marvelous throne room atmosphere in the 4th and 5th chapter. But the 12th and 3rd chapter is really everything that we can. It's in between the seven things that occurred there. The seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. It's past that. There are many theologians that would tell you this is an interlude. Now, we get an interlude, and that is stop these. They stop at 5, and whether you're talking about the seals or the trumpet. And at that point, as something happens, John sort of takes an excursion out after the 5th of each of those. And something occurs. So if you're reading them, you'll see that. And that happens again with the bowls. This is in effect an interlude. It's a stopping and saying, what is happening? Well, he goes all the way in the 12th chapter and 13th chapter, and usually I get a lot of questions on this, so feel free to come back at me with them. But in the 12th and 13th chapter, we see in the dragon, we see Satan taking place. My own feeling is on Satan's case, the dragon, if you will. This is one that had happened at the beginning of time, the beginning of the 12th chapter of Revelation. That is, Satan is having a battle with heaven, and he's part of the angelic. He convinces a third of them to join him, and they eventually lose and get thrown down to earth. And I really believe that you'll find that beginning even before humanity, that we see Satan thrown into earth, and he tries to be in charge of it, and he has control of it because God allows him. So there are different groups that would argue some of that, but that's generally how I would look at it. So, and in terms of the dragon and the destruction of evil, there isn't a society, an early society, that doesn't have one of those mythologies. Isis in Egypt comes to mind. Baal in the Akkadian thought process. The Phoenicians had it. Hittites had it. The Greeks had it. On and on. What's the difference? Did somehow John pull that out? Yeah, he did. He tried to use some of those images. But what he is really saying to us, and this is not said by any of these other religions, is that which could not take place, that which isn't finished, that which was unable to do anything for humanity, God has done it with Jesus. Now, whether you believe in God or Jesus, if you're out there and you don't, that's what John thought. And the images that he's providing here is an imagery of saying Satan and what he tried to do and what Jesus Christ has done, and Satan is just a poor replica of Jesus, and that's the imagery that takes place in the 12th and 13th and 14th and right until the 20th chapter. And we see some of the duplication, the triumphant, if you will, of Satan, the dragon, the beast, the false prophets. These are all duplicates of that which has taken place in terms of what God has done and Jesus has done. The crowns, the other things the images that you see. God has the reality of it. Now, what does that do for us? If we think in terms of Revelation, portraying not that which is on earth to heaven, but pulling heaven it back into earth and given us the perspective of what's in heaven, the reality of life, eternal life. And that's what John was trying to tell the churches. Don't pay any attention to this, even if you were losing your life, because God's in charge. And the reality of heaven is far more important long term than is these things that you're seeing on earth. And so that's a great deal of what John is trying to tell us in the book of Revelation. And when you read Revelation, if you start thinking in terms of he's writing a letter to the 7 churches, he's trying to get them to wake up and address issues within themselves, because God is eternal, and whatever value you have right now isn't eternal. It isn't something you can grasp a hold of. That's what John's doing. If we look at ourselves and think in terms of the 21st century, you see the lesson right away. Don't think in terms of this lucrative country that we live in the United States, if that's where you're living at. Think in terms of what am I supposed to be doing in relationship to God and praising Him long term, because that's the eternal proposition. That's the message of Revelation. And that's all it is. All John's trying to do is give you a Star Wars effect so that you'll wake up and follow God. And that's what he was trying to do with these. For example, there's a discussion when he writes Pergamum about the serpent's throne and scepter. You'll see that in the 2nd, 3rd chapter. That throne they actually had. They worshiped on it. Now, somebody carted it off. I believe it's in Germany now these days, the actual throne. But it was in Pergamum. And they actually have a throne, carved serpents, etc. John mentions that when he's talking to the church. Excuse me a minute. Again, though, we end up with reality here. John is trying to get them to understand that there is something very, very important in terms of them listening to what God wants them to do rather than themselves. Laodicea comes to mind. Laodicea had been destroyed by an earthquake. By the way, that's one of the reasons why this is probably AD 95. Laodicea was destroyed by an earthquake, I think the 60s or 70s. And they were able to make a comeback economically without even accepting Caesar's offer of help. And he talks about that. And obviously, it's all but impossible if this was written earlier than AD 95. They made a comeback. They were economically independent. They were proud of themselves. They were arrogant. And you see all that through when you read about the church in Laodicea. Now, this dragon has, 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. What we cannot do when we're doing this, let's see, what have I got? Okay. Let's talk about these things a little bit. When we're reading Revelation, let's pray about it first. If you're a person that's not adhering to what God's planned, then have a discussion with other people. But I would suggest all Christians, pray about what you're reading in Revelation. That's it. The number one thing you can start to do. Read with humility. Don't assume that all the things you've heard in the past are legitimate. Read it as you should be reading the Bible all the way through this time. Study it in terms of what does it tell me rather than me trying to tell the Bible. And Revelation is one of those texts. All the texts are that way. But Revelation, you just cannot tell the Bible what it's supposed to be saying. There are numerous people that have done that. They make an immense amount of money. And okay, they do. Is it legitimate? No. And read with the first century audience. Don't assume something in the text that the first century audience didn't understand. We don't need to. Let's figure out what John was trying to write to them, and we can do that pretty easily in most cases, and see what they would have absorbed out of it, and then make the application to ourselves. And what I was about to tell you earlier, and I stopped because of the slide, don't read Revelation in a historical chronological order. It isn't. They go through with the seals, and they almost get through, and then they jump back, and the trumpets start all over again, and then the bowls start all over again. There's not a historical chronological order in the book of Revelation. You jump into the 12th chapter that I mentioned, you'll find, if I'm right, and I think I can make a lot of argument, that Satan was before time started, and he had a fight with God, etc. And then you immediately find Jesus being mentioned there in terms of the woman, the baby, and etc. You have a lot of time that flows through in the first 4 or 5 verses. John is trying to get you pointed in that kind of thought process. Before time, God was in charge. When Satan did X, Y, Z, God took care of it. When Satan has come to earth and tried to pull people away from God, God's trying to take care of it. How did he take care of it? He sent himself, if you will, God incarnate among humanity. And was there problems? Absolutely. Jesus was crucified, etc. And all of that takes place after having discussed it in some form or fashion, in the seals and in the bowls, and eventually in the trumpets, etc. that's going to take place. But don't read this as a historical chronological order. This happened, that happened, and this has to be that way. If you do, you'll come up with some real issues trying to understand Revelation. You won't be able to. It's that simple. It's not written that way. Despite arguments by groups of people that says, I know exactly what it says. We know no more about the second coming of Jesus than his disciples did in the 24th chapter of Matthew. We don't know. We're not meant to know. It isn't that we have to know. What are you doing with your app? Are you adhering to what God wants you to do, 7 churches? Are you falling into difficulties in terms of your economic pressures? Are you following satanic kinds of issues? How are you handling your life now? That's what he asked the 7 churches. That's what we're being asked as well. To answer those questions, we don't need to know when Jesus is returning. We're not going to find out anyway. But it wasn't a preamble in Revelation to try to tell us. Now, real quickly, again, our vertical axis is the sovereignty of God. That is, whatever we are involved with, God is in charge. And the horizontal, if you will, has to do with Christians persevering, despite what we run into. The perseverance of saints, if you will. The perseverance of those who have committed themselves to God. So our vertical, if you will, is God. Our horizontal is that says, no matter what happens in this life, I am going to persevere. And John is trying to tell the 7 churches that. And that's a lesson we can grasp ourselves in the 21st century. We don't have emperor worship. We don't worry about that too much. But what we are doing periodically is worshiping other things. I'm worshiping my job. I'm worshiping how much money I have. I'm worshiping how big a house I might have. I'm looking upon that and say, I've done a good job. We do that. America is full of that. Are we helping others that are poor? Do we care about them? Those are messages that he had for the 7 churches. Those are messages that we have for ourselves. Now, a couple of items in terms of the worship, the emperor worship. You see the mortal wound that's mentioned in, I believe, the 13th chapter. What was the mortal wound? Well, Rome had a mortal wound. The most powerful empire of the world had ever known had a mortal wound. When did they have it? AD 68. And how do I know that? Because at that point, Nero committed suicide, and they went through 3 emperors in less than 1 year. The filling of the outskirts of Rome and those who were always fighting with them, etc., we got it made now. Now is the time to take Rome. But Vespasian came right back from what he was trying to do in Palestine. Him and his son Titus was destroying Palestine, and Titus eventually finishes it off in AD 70 with the temple destruction. Vespasian comes back and says, I'm going to take charge of this mess. And he does. And from an empire standpoint, he was extraordinarily effective, unbelievably effective, such that eventually he dies, Titus takes over, and then, of course, Domitian, which this is written on, it goes from there. Each one of these individuals, they made him a god. In fact, there's a thing in Rome that still has Titus' his name up there, and those who believe that Titus was going up to wherever you go up to, if you're Titus. And there's a nomenclature right in Rome of what Titus had done. So the mortal wound that we see there has some historical references to it. There's a great deal of history, probably why I enjoy Revelation, but there's a great deal of history in there, and you just got to dig it out. And the Nero Effect is one. And one of the problems early on was feeling as though maybe this was written during the late 60s, and I'm arguing that it was probably in the mid-90s, and most everyone else would too, is because it talks about the resurrection of Nero. In effect, if you'll read through the text, you'll find that. That was a popular thought process that Nero was he didn't really die. He was just going to get resurrected and come back and take over again. That was a Roman kind of thought process that if you went out to the city and say, is Nero alive? Well, it's sort of like asking, is Elvis around? Oh yeah, he's alive, and he's going to come back and take over. That was a rumor that was going on. Now, what does John compare that to? Right away you can see it. Who was resurrected that's real is Jesus. And so John is comparing that rumor, if you will, that has no validity to Jesus being resurrected. And so if we look back in those issues, we'll pick it up. I guess that's about probably all I have time to start talking about the history. Otherwise, I'll go on forever in the history on it. I imagine there's going to be a lot of questions afterwards. Every interpreter, that is you and I, every reader, I should have used that vocabulary instead of interpreter because people think they have to be a professional to be an interpreter. You don't. Every reader of Revelation should be asking themselves 2 basic questions. What is a symbol portrays in world history, or if you will, in the 1st century, or soon thereafter? And what is the background knowledge do I have to determine what its meaning is? Only then, after you understand what the symbol meant to them, can you extract from that a meaning for the 21st century. Now, does everything happen in the first century? No, but they understood the meaning. Whatever we do, we can't take a newspaper effect, and that's what I got up there. I know people have made millions of dollars making movies, writing books regarding the newspaper effect. That is, whoever is the most onerous at that point in time, this revelation is applicable to. Hitler comes to mind if you want some history on it. Was he an antichrist? Well, I guess he's certainly a portrayer of an antichrist. Stalin would fall in that category. The U.S. in some ways, some other countries feel like the U.S. and its government and all the things we do might fall in that kind of category. And others that, in fact, one theologian, excellent theologian, I won't put his name out there, believed when he was young and he started diving into Revelation, he thought that a quarry where near he lived was in Indiana. They were making rocks, and that's what the temple was going to be made of. He goes, and a whole bunch of other things. There was a computer in Belgium at the time that could win a chess, and he thought that was the epitome of being in charge of some of these things. It goes on and on. But that's a newspaper attitude that says whatever is happening to me around me is important, and therefore that's what Revelation was talking about. It is not. What Revelation was talking about is to a group of people that were going to be persecuted, and John says, stay the course, persevere. God is going to win. And that's what the message ought to be to us. We don't need to worry about whether there's a local antichrist or not. What we need to be worrying about is how are we living our lives. And that's all that John makes a point of that. I think I mentioned some text. Wow. I mentioned some text to you. John extracts, let's see if I got, somewhere I have a slide for this, but I'll just start right now. John uses the Old Testament more than any other text in the Bible and the New Testament. There's 20 some odd quotations out of Daniel. There's 20 some odd quotations out of Isaiah. Ezekiel has a power of them, and there's out of Genesis. It goes on and on. There's more than 250 texts quoted in the book of Revelation from the Old Testament. Are they precise like we can pick up in some of our other letters? No, they're not. He takes allusions out of there and makes them something important to those first century people. So as he makes that application, we have to flow with him. And that's not easy. And it does suggest that you have to read the Old Testament. And it does suggest you have to be open to what the Old Testament is telling you. But John is now taken and he's extrapolating meaning from the Old Testament to the first century in AD 90 to those Christians who needed support. That's how he's written the text. That's where the image is. And I say he, I should qualify it from a Christian point of view, from my point of view, if you will. The Holy Spirit is directing him in that and giving him the images in which to see. And he's attempting to convey those images to those 7 churches, or to us, if we want to look at it that way. All right, the beast of the chapters in 11:13. Who do they refer to? Well, I think I've made some comments, but is it Nero, world empires, the Pope? Protestants look at it that way. I don't, by the way. Hitler, or something else. There's all kinds of things that you can take a newspaper effect with, and that's what it did. Is it in the first few verses in the 11th chapter and the 12th chapter? Are they destruction of Jerusalem, church age, a final period of tribulation? Some of that is a doctrinal issue, and I'm really not going to address it. When I've taught Revelation in the past, particularly when I get to the 20th and 21st chapter and we talk about millennialism, usually what I tell my class is and I take a millennialist point of view, but if Jesus shows up early and he's there for 1,000 years, I'm going to join him. If he shows up 1,000 years later and he asks me to come with him, I'm going to do that, the post-millennial. And if it's an amillennium, I'm still going to join him. a good story, and I'll take a minute to tell you this. When during one of my seminary training, I had a class with Dr. Tenney. He's since passed away. One of the foremost theologians in the middle of the 19th century, or the 20th century, I shouldn't say 19th, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He wrote what once was the premier text on the New Testament, the survey of the New Testament, a whole bunch of other things in Revelation. And I was in one of his classes. And he takes a premillennialist point of view. And and we were in Romans, not Revelation. He said, if anybody can explain the 9th to the 11th chapter of Romans, and you get a chance to me, then I'll discard my premillennialist point of view. And of course, I was bright, young, and egotistic. I was the only one that was stupid enough to stand up and said, Dr. Cheney, I'm going to challenge you on that. And which I did, and he immediately destroyed me. I since have learned a lot more, but that tells you, don't go in thinking what the answers are ahead of time, no matter what you think, what you've heard, no matter who's taught it. Let the scriptures tell you. Now, today I think I could answer Dr. Cheney. He's not around, but I'd like to talk to him anyway. When we're reading this text, let's let it talk to us. And yeah, you're going to need a commentary when it comes to Revelation. I'm not going to suggest anything different. You need to understand, unless you're a historian, and if that's the case, you can chase down some of these kinds of things. Okay, we've got enough time for me to address this, and this is important. There are 4 major thought processes on interpreting. Are those large enough to read? No, huh? It tells me something about slides when I'm producing a new computer. There's a historical point of view that was picked up in the 12th century and it's gone since. And it suggests in a way that everything that John talks about in Revelation had to have taken place before AD 70. And there's a lot of issues with that. Not very many theologians would hold to that today. We do have a group of people within our brotherhood, by the way, called AD 70 group, that would fall in that. I'm sure I'm about to get questions from them, if any of them are on this. But really, not too many people do that. I got asked at lunch the other day what viewpoint I take, a Peterist, an idealist, a futurist point of view. I really take the bottom one, which is sort of a mixture of them. I cheat that way, trying to take out whatever is the best of the groups. But a Peterist point of view, they argue that the things that took place that John's writing about only is applicable to that period of time. Now, there are some good arguments about it. There are some issues that the prophetic issues that John talks about, that which is going to come a little later. It's very difficult to say that all those occurred during that period of time. But that's a point of view. Idealist point of view is that which says it is more of a spiritual issues. And what John is saying, and what John was saying, every church in every period of time has some of these spiritual issues. You're going to run into an antichrist. You're going to have difficulties, and you're going to have to resurrect yourself. There's some good points in the idealist point of view. But again, I probably take the bottom one, which is eclectic. That is, I bring 2 or 3 of them together, look at the best parts of them, and try to absorb that and within the context of Revelation. Here's where the Old Testament is alluded to. Okay, well, here's some of your numbers, if you will. There's 46 references in Isaiah. Daniel has 29. Ezekiel, probably 27 or so. There's 20 some odd in Psalms. And, of course, they come from Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Joel, and Genesis. Again, all from the Old Testament that John is writing. That's his real point, is with the Old Testament. Jesus Christ, if you will, is a predominant part of this. We see Jesus, or Christ portrayed, if you will, tying it all together all the way through. His death provides the elimination and defeat of Satan. It's one of the ironic parts that's so neat about John's text. And he tries to get them to understand that. The success not only of Jesus and the Christ being over Satan, you're saying, well, okay, God incarnate, he should win. But he also tries to say that the victory of death that's occurring to those in the seven churches, second chapter, verse 10 or 11, you'll find somebody who had already died, was being crucified, that the death of them is a further destruction of Satan. So rather than Satan being successful with the death of those followers of Jesus, he produces his ultimate failure following of being successful. Christ, of course, is the preeminent martyr, if you will, the faithful true witness in Revelation 3:14. We're called upon to be a witness. And that Greek word is martyr. Most of the time we think about martyrs being as dying, and that's how we immediately define them. No, martyr is that which is a witness to it. A witness that's going to adhere to the direction that you're being a witness to, that says, I'm going to do that no matter what. It's a witness that has a commitment behind it. So it's not just, I saw it on the street down there and tell Ricardo that guy was speeding. It is one in which says, I'm not going to ever speed, I'm not going to do that, I'm following it adamantly. That's what a martyrism means, even on to death. Now, because so many happened to die and was persecuted, and they were called martyrs because they were witnessing for Jesus, we've got into the term of martyrism as being a death-like commitment. It doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be in the sense of initially. It should always be, I'm a witness for Jesus Christ no matter what it's going to take. The major title for Jesus is the Lamb. The sacrificial Lamb is the Lion of Judah, is what John said. It is going to be the ultimate warrior, if you will, this sacrificial Lamb. Amazing story. And of course, the oneness motif with God, the Alpha and the Omega, we see that in the 8th chapter of the first chapter, the 8th verse, if you will, the 21st chapter with God, and then you see it with Jesus in the first chapter as well, and etc. We see Jesus and God both Alpha and Omega. That which was from the very beginning is going to be there at the end. And church, that's what the seven churches, you need to sign up for that, because that's the eternal message. And all the things that happen in between, the destruction and the pain and the agony and the death and whatever, that is temporal. That is that which is not going to last. That isn't reality. Again, go back to my thought process. John is trying to bring heaven to earth so that we can see what is real. Not from earth to heaven and saying, this is what's happening to me. No, it's heaven is in charge of everything, and I'm signing up for that, and whatever happens to me in this life isn't as relevant as my commitment to God and Jesus. My slides got out of order. Okay. The defense of God's character is certainly a big part of the theme of the book. Why? Because John wants you to realize that God is the emperor and not Caesar. Whatever you're doing with emperor worship is not nearly as relevant as the fact that you ought to be praising a part of God. And that's why that beautiful chapter in the fourth and fifth chapter of Revelation, when you get in the throne room and the exaltation of God comes out. What a magnificent picture. John says, that's who our emperor is. That's more important than your emperor worship that you've been doing. So we see God's judgment and righteous character, 14th chapter, and where he's making judgment based on all kinds of opportunity for repentance all the way through. Why don't you do something or I'm going to send judgments to you? And he takes the whole plague issue out of Exodus and makes it applicable in Revelation. And the first four seals goes in that kind of category. He pulls those plagues out and says, God's judgment is on you. Why don't you change your mind, Pharaoh? Well, why don't you change your mind, church? Why don't you listen to God, because he's going to do that? And God, his righteous character is providing justice, if you will. But why? Because sin eventually turns on itself. Sin eventually self-destructs. It may not happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen. Your body is going to self-destruct. Your people are going to self-destruct. Evil will self-destruct. And God's judgment is proven and vindication of his righteousness by what's occurred. We see worship as highlighted throughout the book of Revelation. And of course, I've mentioned several times the 4th and 5th chapter, but worship is not an interlude. Worship is all the way through. That we are adoring and praising God for whom he is what John is saying. Not the emperor worship, if you will, God. At every point we can do, we lift up God. John is saying, you guys do that to us, we ought to be doing that as well. And the heavenly worship frames all of this, the interludes, if you will, in the 12th and 14th chapter. And of course, worship instills that in the last few chapters from the 19th through the 22nd. Okay. Some comments regarding reading Revelation. Pay a lot of attention when John interprets what the message is. That is, don't just sort of skip by it. When John or the angel says this is what happens and why it happens, pay a lot of attention to that, because the symbols are being interpreted for us. We tend to just jump into the next one. No, just slow down, read what John has said about him, what the angels say about him. And pay a great deal of attention to the meaning of the apocalyptic images. Those images had relevance to the first century, and just like the issue of the Nero resurrection, if you will, and Jesus' resurrection, and the satanic kind of responses. And you got the beasts that take place in the 13th and 12th chapter. You have the woman in labor and whatever. Mary, probably not. Mother of humanity, if you will. More than likely the church, really, in that 12th chapter. And if perhaps even Israel, if you will, before, where bringing Jesus into the forefront for humanity is what she was all about. I would argue that one as much as anything. That is, when you read that 12th chapter, it isn't really as much about Mary as it is God developing the Jews, bringing forth Jesus as the baby. And of course, Satan is there to try to attack the baby, and just as he was trying to attack in heaven, he's going to do everything to try to destroy. He's the one that goes after and brings Jesus into the cross and fails because of that. Those are the kinds of messages that John tries to tell in the book of Revelation. I have quickly gone through Revelation. I understand that, perhaps more so than anyone. I think I mentioned before that last time I taught the book of Revelation, it took me 6 months. It is full of various historical data that I just absolutely enjoy, and I try to portray that. So if you have questions, and I expect you to do, I usually get inundated with questions on the book of Revelation, then throw them at me. Do I have all the answers? Absolutely not. Will I give you my perspective? That's what it is. Again, I've enjoyed this. I appreciate the opportunity to have done this, how to study the Bible, principles. Pay a lot of attention to what was happening then and there before you go out.